Welcome to the Meb Faber Show, where the focus is on helping you grow and preserve your wealth. Join us as we discuss the craft of investing and uncover new and profitable ideas, all to help you grow wealthier and wiser. Better investing starts here.
Meb Faber is the co-founder and chief investment officer at Cambria Investment Management. Due to industry regulations, he will not discuss any of Cambria's funds on this podcast. All opinions expressed by podcast participants are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of Cambria Investment Management or its affiliates. For more information, visit CambriaInvestments.com.
This episode is sponsored by our friends at YCharts. If you're a financial advisor, you know that time is one of your most valuable assets. Between prepping for client meetings, creating proposals, staying on top of market trends, and managing portfolios, your days are packed. That's why the tools you rely on have to work seamlessly, and YChart's new Quick Extract does exactly that. Quick Extract is the ultimate time saver for portfolio analysis. It lets you upload client portfolios in nearly any format, PDFs, screenshots, spreadsheets, so you can skip the hours of manual data entry and dive straight into analysis. In just seconds, Quick Extract sets you up to focus on what matters most: high-impact tasks, building client relationships, and driving AUM growth. If you're ready to see how Quick Extract can transform your practice, click on the link in the show notes to learn more. Get 20% off your initial YCharts professional subscription when you start your free YCharts trial and tell them that Meb sent you, new customers only. You can go to go.ycharts.com/Meb-Faber. Welcome back, everybody. We got a really great show today. Our guest is Joel Nagel. Joel is the founder of the international law firm Nagel Associates, which has a big focus on asset protection. He's also the chairman of Caye International Bank, or Caye, we'll find out. Has served as ambassador to Austria, the United Nations in Vienna, and to Croatia and Slovenia on behalf of the Belizean government. I saw Joel give a presentation. I loved it. I said, I got to get him on the show to talk about some of these topics like asset protection. What does he do with his clients? Joel, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Is it Caye or Caye International Bank?
We pronounce it Caye, but lots of people say Caye, and there's not a problem with that.
I figured the kickoff topic with you, for the listeners who aren't familiar, give us just like a little overview of you and your firm, because some of the things you focus on are a bit unique.
Think of what you do and how you advise people. In a sporting event, you're the offense. You're telling them how to score and how to carry the ball down the field. Asset protection is really more about defense. It's about making sure you keep what you have, protecting, preserving. I'm not an investment advisor, so I don't tell people, oh, you should invest in this or you should invest in that. But frequently we do say, well, why don't you think about the investment that you want to do? Think about doing it this way. Let's do it through your IRA. Let's do it in an insurance wrapper. Let's put it in a foreign trust. And that's really with the idea of protecting and preserving the investment itself. And of course, everybody out there, they all have different risk profiles. So if you deliver premature babies for a living, you're an obstetrician, your risk profile is very different than if you're an English teacher. Same thing with entrepreneurs. A lot of times people, their risk profile changes. You're in a high risk business, you sell it, you go from a very high risk profile to a low risk profile. And so frequently we use some domestic strategies, but our niche is really in the offshore world. And generally that's not because we're trying to hide or evade taxes or anything crazy like that. It's really for the systemic protection. The US is a very pro-plaintiff country. If you look at, for example, football over the last 20 years, we've gone from a league that favored defense to a league that favors offense. And US definitely favors offense when it comes to litigation. So other countries in the world aren't that way, though. And the old saying is money flows to where it's treated best. And if you're worried about your money, not from, hey, am I making the right investments, but hey, I'm worried about lawsuits, I'm worried about taxes, I'm worried about my estate. We can hopefully have time to talk a little bit about estate taxes, but those are really messed up right now. And they're set to get really even worse next year. But the point is that if you're proactive in how you approach the defense, you can really do a lot to make sure that your money's safe, that it's not going anywhere, a plaintiff's not going to get it, an ex-spouse isn't going to get it, and things like that. And generally, I would say most of our clients, when they work with us, they feel like they can sleep better at night. And once we help them sleep better on the defense, then the offense comes roaring back in. Now they have their money sitting in, let's say, an offshore trust, but now it's there. Now it switches back to offense. Well, how are we going to invest it? What are we going to do with it? So we're a piece of the puzzle. We're not the whole piece. And I think a lot of times on the offense, people only think about that, like that's the only piece. And we say, well, wait a minute, hold on. Let's think about the defense.
I feel like most people, it's like the outer layer of the onion is like, all right, I want my money to be safe. I'm going to invest in T-bills, or here's my diversified portfolio. And then they kind of stop there. They're like, all right, it's safe. I'm good. But listening to you, I was like, oh man, there's like 7 more layers of things that most people, particularly very wealthy people, should be thinking about that honestly, I had never thought about in my entire life.
For a lot of people, what you said, maybe that's enough. And we're not out there to say everybody has to go out and build a rocket ship. I think the more wealth you have and the more risks that you have, if you go up the spectrum to professions that are very litigious, doctors, surgeons, people in that industry, but also investment advisors that tend to get sued a lot, even lawyers. I mean, we actually have a fair amount of plaintiff lawyers. They tell me all the time, look, we know what we can do to other people. We don't want that to happen to us, which I always find to be ironic. But what we try to do is keep it proportionate. We're not going to suggest you go out and build this very complex structure when you have $200,000-$300,000. Frequently, the first asset protection tool is an asset protection trust. And the reason that an asset protection trust becomes so important for a lot of people, it tends to be people that have at least a couple $1,000,000 because of the cost to create it, set it up, and to operate it. But you don't have to be a decamillionaire, 100 million, or anything like that, centimillionaire. And the reason is that a trust is actually the oldest legal structure in existence in the English common law system. It's been around about 1,200 years, dating back to the Middle Ages. And the key thing for most people, unlike a company, people say, oh, a company, I can use a company to protect my assets. And we'll talk about companies in a minute, but companies, they're separate on the one hand, but on the other hand, you own the shares in them. So they link back to you. Trusts don't do that. It was a fiction that was created over 1,000 years ago, and it still is in existence. And that fiction is that the trust is a separate juridical legal person. And what that means is when I transfer an asset to that separate legal juridical person, and you come after me and you sue me, I can put my hand on the Bible. I can swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And that asset's not mine anymore. So if it's not mine, how can somebody take it from me? They really can't. How can they get it from the trust? Well, it's either impossible, depending on the jurisdiction, or you have to have an independent cause of action against the trust because the trust is a separate person. So if I've wronged you somehow and you sue me, I don't have the asset. You sue the trust, didn't wrong you. If your teenage daughter runs over somebody and you're being sued for millions of dollars, the trust didn't run that person over. So that's a really important distinction. It's separate, and because it's separate, it adds a lot of protection. That doesn't mean that you can't benefit from that structure. A lot of clients get hung up on the word control. Oh, I can't really control it. Well, indirectly you can, because we can draft the trust to have certain purpose. And that purpose could be to provide for support and welfare for you. But you being the beneficiary of the trust is different than you being the legal owner of the trust. That's a really important concept. And that works really well for a lot of clients. Companies we mentioned, frequently they go hand in glove with a trust, particularly when there's an active business. If it's just all passive assets, stocks and bonds and mutual funds and things like that, they can just sit directly in the trust. You don't need to have a company. But if there are active businesses involved, then frequently you want to have a company to create separation. You don't want the trust to be engaged in business, or maybe there could be a cause of action against the trust, right? We just said you needed to have a separate cause of action against trust. But if the trust is engaged in business, well, it's possible that that could happen. So companies are important. I tell people that companies are like a shield. It's a shield that you're holding out in front of you. You have these incoming flaming arrows, and the shield's going to protect you from those arrows. But the converse is not true. If somebody is suing you, then that company and the assets in that company, that's just one more asset that you have. And that means that if they get a judgment against you, the judge can order you to turn your company over to the plaintiff. That's why frequently companies are hand in glove with trusts. People who are working in civil law countries frequently like foundations. Foundations are sort of the equivalent of trusts in civil law countries. Trust is a common law vehicle. Foundations are civil law. The French Napoleonic Code, you tend to find them in the Germanic countries, Spain, France, in Latin America, for example. whereas the English common law would be the Caribbean, Belize, the Cook Islands, Nevis, the Channel Islands, those parts of the world, Bermuda. Anything you can think of that's a former British colony, it's probably a good place for an offshore trust. And then the civil law would be some of the Caribbean islands, Martinique, going around the Horn, the Germanics, you have Liechtenstein, Switzerland, places like that that provide for that type of vehicle. It's not exactly the same as a trust, but there's a strong overlap in the sense that it's a separate legal juridical person. There's insurance, there's millions of different ideas. But I think those are some of the sort of common building blocks that people look at when they start looking at creating offshore structures.
As you think about onshore, offshore, I think people in their head, maybe less so today, but used to always think I'm hiding something or I'm doing something shady. But I've heard you mention before in your talk where there's reasons to have some of these trusts offshore or however you structure them and in certain countries. And it's not that. You're not trying to be sketchy or not pay taxes or something. So maybe talk to us a little bit about that. What's the benefits of, other than the fishing and diving, of getting to go down to Belize and other locales?
The days of people walking around with suitcases filled with money and hiding out somewhere, those are really over. These structures that you create, and it doesn't matter whether it's a domestic structure or a foreign structure, under US law, you have certain obligations. And one of those obligations is to report even the creation of that. In addition, the money that goes into it, you have that obligation. But guess what? Your bank that sends money from your US assets to offshore also has independently the same obligation. And a couple of my banker friends have told me, and I believe it, that when you fill out a wire transfer to send money to Belize, US government knows about that transfer before you've even left the bank. It's literally real time. When they're filling out the paperwork to send the money, a version of that transfer is going directly to the Treasury Department. So there's no like hide and seek. In fact, I tell people it's the opposite. It's like show and tell. We want people to know in the certain circumstances, if I'm being sued, I want it to be very clear. Hey, you know what? You want to sue me? Go ahead. All my money's sitting in an offshore trust. Here's a copy of the trust document. Here's the trustee. I don't have any assets. If you sue me, you're not going to get anything. So have at it. And that usually causes people to stop in their tracks, not because you're hiding, but because you're sort of show and tell. You're letting them know it's there. And they realize that it changes the dynamics of the fight. Their lawyer isn't going to be comfortable as they might be in, say, Pennsylvania, where I live, Colorado, where you live. The plaintiff lawyer there has maybe brought 1,000 lawsuits, so they're very comfortable with that. Now you tell them, oh, well, to get the money, you have to file a lawsuit in Belize or Nevis. And they're like, well, I don't really even know how that works. And then they realize that, oh, but I need to have a separate cause of action against the trust. And how does that work? And pretty soon, what I've seen happen frequently is they go back to their client and say, we can represent you. We're probably going to have to get local counsel, and the local counsel and we as well aren't going to work on a contingency fee basis like most litigation. And that means you, Mr. Client, Mr. Plaintiff, you're going to have to fund the litigation itself. So yeah, we can proceed, but you might be into this for $25,000, $50,000, $100,000 just to make it happen. And of course, there's no guarantees. And quite honestly, the law firm would rather be doing something else, because in the same time that they're trying to coordinate litigation in another part of the world, they could be doing 20 other cases that they know they are going to get paid on, most likely. So is it a perfect strategy? Not necessarily perfect, but you're definitely not the low-hanging fruit. You make it very difficult from the outset. You let them know you're changing the game on them. You're not playing checkers anymore, you're playing chess, and you're doing it three-dimensional chess in other parts of the world because, by the way, yeah, the trust is in Belize, but underneath that, there's a company in Panama, there's a foundation in Liechtenstein, they might have their investments in Singapore. Where are the funds? Really difficult to pin down, and how are you going to get at them? And it's going to be a long process. Maybe it's going to take years. I mean, look at a very famous case like O.J. Simpson. People would say, well, why do you want to bring that case up? Clearly did something bad. Clearly there were people that were entitled to his money, but before, not after, because you can't run out and set up one of these structures after you have a problem. You have to do it before you have a problem. He had a really solid offshore trust the victims that brought the lawsuits, the family of the boyfriend of his wife, they brought lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit, and they could never get out the trust assets. Why? Because the trust didn't do anything. The trust didn't murder anybody. The trust didn't embezzle or defraud anyone. And then even finding out where the assets were being held, there were multiple places where the funds were. And it's not a transparent system where, like the US, where you can just find out, well, how much money is sitting in his bank account. And everybody was very closed-lipped about it. So even at his death, the funds were never the Goldman family. I couldn't think of it before, but the Goldman family, they were never able to get at those trust assets. And most people don't have that level of intense scrutiny and people trying to attack their assets. A less motivated plaintiff, and once they find out through this sort of show and tell exercise through discovery, it's called litigation, it's called discovery. When they find out in discovery that the bulk, if not all of your assets are in a structure like that, they usually just give up. And that's what we're going for with that kind of structure. So there's no magic bullet to make taxes go away, but it's a very intimidating structure in terms of letting people know that this is not going to be an easy fight and you're probably not going to win. So you might as well just give up.
When you say trust and offshore, what are the big haymakers that this is really addressing?
I would say most people that contact us are in one of three or two of three or three of three categories. The first one is litigation. That's your classic doctor worried about being sued. It could also touch on things like you said, divorce or other bankruptcies, things like that. We can circle back to that, but most people are going to say, well, I'm not worried about litigation. So why don't we put the litigation on the side for a minute and we can come back to it. The second one is estate planning, and most people don't realize how limited they are in their estate plan, how much they can put in a structure, who can get their assets, how long they can leave it in a structure. The general common law concept is a life in being plus 21 years. So that's the longest you can make a trust go, but which is usually, like, let's say, a child or a grandchild, and then 21 years beyond that life. It's called the rule against perpetuities, meaning you can't leave an asset into perpetuity without there being what's called a life being to take the asset. But other jurisdictions know the concept that money flows where it's treated best. So that's just an old English common law concept. But legislatively, many of the jurisdictions that are financial centers, offshore hubs, have changed that. So they've done away with that. So if you want to make a dynasty trust, let's say for your family that goes on for the next 1,000 years, then offshore is the way to do it. So now we've got better protection against lawsuits, better estate planning. Again, if you aren't worried about litigation, you call me up, you're not worried about litigation, you're not worried about, at my death, I want everything to go to my kids, you're probably not there in terms of being a good candidate, regardless of how much money you have. But then the third category, I would say, has really grown a lot in the last 10 years of my practice. And that is, most people don't realize it until they find something that they want to invest in and they're told they can't invest because they are American. About 80% of the world's investments are closed to American citizens. Well, why is that? Well, we've got this very overreaching government that basically says, if you, a company, a partnership, an individual in another part of the world, if you make an investment available to one U.S. citizen, then you subject yourself to U.S. securities regulations. So I had a client the other day, they were looking at some hedge fund in Malaysia, and they were reading through the private placement memorandum. And when they got to page 3, thing came up on their screen and said, sorry, we see your URL is emanating from in the US and this investment's closed to US citizens. And that was the end of it. So what did he do? He called me, and I called a foreign trustee that I do a lot of work with from outside the country, contacted them and said, hey, we're interested in this. They got the documentation right away. Because remember, going back to what we said at the beginning, a trust is a separate legal juridical person. And that legal juridical person takes on the nationality of the jurisdiction where it's created. So if I create a trust in Nevis, I now have a Nevis person, not a US person. Even if the person putting in the money is American, and if the future beneficiaries that take the money out are American, the legal owner is the Nevis trust and the Nevis trustee. So basically, foreign trusts have become sort of the easy hack or workaround for investing in these things, it doesn't open up the door to U.S. scrutiny, U.S. SEC oversight. And you'll see it all the time. People say we're open to trust structures, foundations, foreign individuals, but not U.S. individuals. And that's the reason. So even people who maybe don't care about estate planning and they're not even worried about being sued, that's like the third reason. So most people, like I said, have one, two, or all three of those reasons. There's dozens of others we can certainly talk about, special needs trusts and things like that. But those three, most of your viewers would probably, that would resonate. One of those things probably resonates with them. And either they want to make an investment, they can't, they want to do estate planning that they can't, or they're worried about litigation, and they don't believe that the structure in the state where they live is protective enough for them.
What are some other major risk or a major solution in the asset protection world?
A lot of times people will get the joke that their most important asset is themselves. And we just had an election in the United States, and we, in the time leading up to the election, we were getting many inquiries about second passports, second residence.
Yeah, of course. I feel like it's every 4 years, the Google search of like half the country is going to be mad about who just got elected. So people are all like, I got to move to somewhere, whatever.
Lots of Americans live outside the US and are commonly referred to as expats, right? You've heard that term, expat. But there's legal term, which is expatriation, which isn't just living outside the US, it's actually living outside the US and giving up your US citizenship. And not that many people honestly do that. I think the most recent statistics, it's about 10,000 people a year. But I actually believe after the election, there's a certain faction of people that really hate Trump, and they may expatriate. And if Kamala had won, then you would have seen a different group. One of my friends said, Joel, you have the best business in the world because you have an unlimited marketing budget that you don't have to pay for. He's right about that to a certain extent. I mean, as long as the country is so divided and polarized, there are always people thinking about these things. And as a lawyer, I'm not recommending to anybody or any of your listeners that they expatriate. But if you back up a step and say, well, what's the reason that you might want to get a second residence or a second citizenship? I would say, well, there's a lot of them. And you cannot expatriate legally, for example, unless you have another citizenship, because U.S. law does not allow you to become a stateless person. So I can't just go out and say, hey, I don't want to be American anymore. Okay, well, what are you? Oh, I'm nothing. I'm a citizen of the world. You hear people saying stuff like that. Well, you can't do that legally. So even if I never give up my U.S. citizenship, to be able to do that, you must have a second citizenship. So I have lots of clients over the years that have gotten passports and residencies, and they take that document, they stick it in their safety deposit box, they never use it. So it's just insurance. That's one group of people. Then you have other people that say, oh, well, the U.S. tax system actually favors people who live outside the United States and work outside the United States. And there's something called the foreign earned income exclusion. It's about $120,000. The first $120,000 that you earn outside the United States are not subject to U.S. tax. Now, other countries, you could be a citizen of, say, France, and if you don't live in France, you don't pay any tax. You could make $10 million a year and you pay no tax. So when people complain and say, oh, the French tax system, the wealthiest people have to pay 78% tax or whatever their top rate is, it's right around there, by the way. Well, they can pay 78% tax, or they can move to Belgium and pay zero French tax. So in Europe, that's a common concept because the tax system isn't based on citizenship, it's based on residency. Where do you live and where you work? But the US, based on the Roman system, they're actually the only dynasty or empire. There's only been two empires that have taxed people around the world wherever they live. The Roman one, 2,000 years ago, and the US system today. So if you want to extricate yourself from that system completely, you have to expatriate. But if you don't want to extricate yourself from that, you can move overseas and you can qualify for this foreign earned income exclusion. That, by the way, is per person. So you can have a married couple. In this age now, digital nomads, people can basically live anywhere, work anywhere. If I say to you, hey, you and your wife you can go live in Bahamas and you can earn $250,000 and you're not going to pay any tax. That's big from an asset protection standpoint because you're saving maybe $60,000, $70,000 of tax, which that's money you could use to travel or invest, make your portfolio increase. I mean, that is a true asset protection concept. So when we talk about trust on the one hand for your money, I mean, the residency citizenship part, I think, is another really important part. And 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when I would speak at conferences, there'd be this like one squirrely guy in the back of the room that would want to come up and talk about this. That's not the case anymore. It's very, very common.
Where do most people go?
When people talk to us, the very first question I ask them is, well, where are you from? Your family, where's your ancestral roots? Because there are a lot of countries that make it fairly easy. And there's bureaucracy involved, but they make it fairly easy if within 2, sometimes 3 generations, your family immigrated. And so the Western European countries, most of them have that. It's very impossible, for example, to become a German citizen. But if you have German ancestry like I do, it's actually fairly simple. And before we talk about other options and ways to get citizenship, which almost always involve large amounts of money, we start with the ancestral one because it usually doesn't require any money at all. And in fact, it's a very different concept. Instead of saying you're applying for citizenship, what you're really saying is, hey, I'm applying to have it be recognized that I'm already a citizen. See, it's a little bit of a different concept. Like, hey, my grandfather is German and I qualify for German citizenship. I am German and I want the German state to recognize me as such. That's very different than saying, hey, I'm an American. What are the steps to become German? It's very different. I might have to move there, live there for a long period of time, and then maybe I'll qualify in the future. So ancestry, to me, that's like the hack. That's the short version. It's fast, it's cheap. Once we take that off the table, then we go with, there's 2 more options. I call it the fast, expensive way and the slow, cheap way. And so you have to decide, like, what's more important to you. If a client comes to me and says, hey, I want to get a second citizenship for a variety of reasons, we can circle back to those in a little while if you want, the main reasons. But if time is of the essence, there are citizenship programs, let's say in the Caribbean, where in 6, 8, 10 weeks, not months or years, I can have your citizenship for you. You have to pass a background test. You can't be a criminal. But for the most part, you go through their process. But their process involves money. So you have to be ready to write a check. And within the money side, it sort of divides into 2 areas as well. There's the investment side. Okay, I make a particular kind of targeted investment that the government tells me, if you invest in this at a level above X, then you'll qualify for citizenship. That's one option. The other option is just write the government a check. Usually it goes into some solidarity fund, like a sovereign fund kind of for like a lot of these little small Caribbean islands. Sometimes money goes into a central fund and then only the income of that fund is used for education, roads, and what have you. The Caribbean passports are generally some of the cheapest, and they start at about $100,000 for an individual, maybe go up to $150,000 for a family. The investments usually start at anywhere from $350,000 and they go on up. There are a few programs in Europe. They generally are more expensive. There's golden visas in the southern tier of Europe, Portugal, Spain, Italy, Greece, that you're looking at anywhere from $250,000 to $500,000. But that's only the first step to get a visa to live there. Then you have to live there a number of years. And then after 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, you can become a citizen. A lot of those programs also have language requirements. So you have to jump through a bunch of hoops and hurdles. And at the end of the day, before you're going to get your passport, in Greece, you have to speak Greek. In Portugal, you have to speak Portuguese. I happen to have a Portuguese residence, and we just applied for our permanent residence. And my wife and I had to do a intensive Portuguese class, and it was 4 hours a day, 5 days a week for 2 months. Like, you're making a very big commitment that goes beyond the monetary side, right? It's the time commitment. So circling back to the Caribbeans for a minute, it's pretty straightforward. You write a check or you make an investment. There's about a half dozen countries: Anguilla, Antigua, St. Lucia, Grenada, Dominica. There's a half dozen countries, and they're all pretty similar. They have little differences like, well, how old can your children be? That's been an interesting area. It used to be 18, and then countries figured out, well, maybe we should go to 21, and then some said 25, and now some are saying 30. And it recognizes the fact that you got a lot of people my age looking at in their 50s and 60s, and they're looking at these programs. But then the very first thing, normally it's the wife, not always, but normally the wife is going to say, oh, but honey, I don't want to do this if we can't include the kids. Say, but the kids are graduating from college. They're 24 years old, but they're not going to be able to afford to do this on their own. They're not going to be able to write the check. They're not going to be able to make the investment. So some of the countries have gotten pretty savvy. They're going to charge a little bit more incrementally, but you're not going to pay the same kind of investment for each child as if that child were doing their own application. So those are the fast, expensive versions. Then you have the slow, cheap version. Almost every country in the world has some kind of slow, cheap version. And it's not black or white. There's ones in between where you get preferences that speed up the process. But the slow, cheap process is generally you go through the procedure to apply to move to a country and live there. You have to have some, like a job, or you have enough money to start your own business, employ yourself and buy health insurance, whatever the rules are. But you can generally do that. And most countries are pretty open, particularly to Americans. They recognize you're going to bring skill sets and you're going to bring capital. And so they'll generally allow you to do that. And now you move there and live there full time. Normally that means more than 183 days a year. It has to be your primary residence, which means you're also what's called a tax resident. Again, the European countries differentiate between just having residence versus having tax residence versus being a citizen. The US, we don't have all those distinctions because you get taxed on just being a citizen. So some of the other nuances become irrelevant. But in Europe, okay, now I'm a tax resident, I'm paying my income tax there, and I have to, over a certain period of time, it's anywhere from the short end 3 years, average is about 5 to 6 years. Some countries like Switzerland, it's 12 years. I think the longest in Europe's Andorra, a little tiny country between France and Spain. You have to be a resident for 20 years before you can apply for citizenship. And then there's the language part. So that option, without spending a lot of money, works well for people who they really truly want to move their life there. They got married, they have kids, they got a great job, and they're going there at least for some long period of time. And if you don't want to do that, then you're in the fast, expensive way. And basically the quid pro quo is you don't have to spend these years and years and years or become a tax resident if you just fill in the blank, if you just write a check for $200,000, if you just buy a $500,000 property, whatever the requirement of the country is.
Is there one or two, three things that generally come up the most, or is it so totally customizable, variable that it's like hard to even make generalizations?
The specific problem or issue that causes that person to call me, it's unique to that person, but it does fall into one of a couple pretty frequent categories, right? People are either worried that, hey, I'm really worried about the dollar system. I think the dollar's not going to be the world reserve currency in the next 5 or 10 years. And I want to build assets overseas outside the dollar hegemony, whether it's using crypto or gold and silver, or real estate, or invest in Swiss bonds. That goes into the offense side of the equation. But they're telling us that that is the sort of worrying factor, or they have political problems. Now, I think we probably won't see as many as we were getting in the weeks leading up to the election. Quite honestly, we had people on both sides of the political aisle that were worried that something bad was going to happen the opposite way. But I think we would have had more people had Harris won the election, because part of her mandate was higher taxes, eliminating the estate tax. It would tax at a much lower level the amount of wealth that you could pass on to your children. Right now, for example, on that, just go down that rabbit hole for a minute, the exemption from gift and estate tax, which is how much money you can give during your lifetime or at your death, is $13.5 million. Under the first Trump administration, it had gone under the Obama administration, it was at $5 million. It grew over time through inflation into the 6+ range. And then when Trump did the Trump tax cuts, they doubled that exemption. And now it's still indexed to inflation, so it goes up every year. So this year, it's about $13.5 million. And for a married couple, that's $27 million. Next year, there's a sunset clause that was already baked into the original law where it's going to go back to $5 million. So it would be very normal. If you have under $10 million, you don't worry about the timing. Because whether you do something this year or next year makes no difference. On the other hand, let's say your net worth is 12, 15, 18, 20 million dollars. You're right in that area between 10 and 27. Now you're calling me and saying, Joel, like, I want to take advantage of the current law, because when I make that gift to a trust, a domestic trust or a foreign trust, by the way, it's not unique to foreign trusts. I work in the foreign space predominantly, but you could be talking to a lawyer in Colorado or Pennsylvania about doing a structure domestically. And if you said, I'm worried that I want to get something done this year because the gift and the tax consequences of that gift are based on the law at the time. So if I make that gift, I today can transfer $27 million from my wife and I to a trust, and there's no tax consequences. But next year, that same $27 million gift would be 17 of it would be subject to gift and estate tax, which would be about 50%. So I would lose about, let's say, $8.5 million on the same gift. So that's something that drives people a lot. And that's a political football, by the way. In my career, I've seen that exemption be zero, meaning the very first dollar is taxed. And I've seen the exemption be unlimited. It happened once in 2010 under President Bush. He put into effect a system that phased out the estate tax. 2010 was the year there was no estate tax. But it also had a sunset December 31, 2010, which meant that on January 1, 2011, we went all the way back to there being no exclusion whatsoever. So if you happen to be a guy by the name of George Steinbrenner who owned the New York Yankees and you died in 2010, you actually left a multi-billion-dollar baseball team to your kids and you didn't pay 1 cent of tax. But had he died in 2011, instead, that would have been $400 to $800 million of state tax. So people are constantly working around that, trying to look at where the laws are now, where are they going? I could imagine a Trump administration with the Republican House and Senate could try to make that existing 27 million permanent or even raise it higher. I mean, you think about it, I get in arguments with people all the time. They're like, oh, that is just a way for the rich to avoid paying tax. I'm like, but wait a minute, hold on. The money that they've accumulated, that's after-tax money to begin with. If it's in a tax-deferred vehicle like an IRA, your debt has to come out and it's subject to income tax. But the way it is now, it's subject to income tax and then estate tax, and both of which are pushing 50%. So you can have a scenario, if you have all your money in an IRA, you think, well, this is really great. I'm not paying any tax. I've got $20 million sitting in my IRA. Well, if you don't have any exclusion from gift and estate tax, that's going to come out as that $20 million the year of your death as ordinary income. So you're going to lose, let's say 40%, you're going to lose $8 million gone. Now you have $12 million. That's going to go through the estate tax hoop and hurdle, which goes to 50%. So now $6 million is gone. So if you're $20 million in your IRA, only $6 million goes to your heirs. Like, that sucks, right? So I always take the position that that's already after tax money to begin with. Why should I be penalized instead of spending it? What the tax law really says is you should go out and spend all your money. And if you save it, then we're going to tax it again. So I'm a huge anti-estate tax person, not because I care about billionaires like Warren Buffett, but it really comes down to a lot of entrepreneurs. I see entrepreneurs, farmers. I mean, I have a farmer client in Iowa. He owns 12,000 acres of property. This is not a rich person. He makes a couple $100,000 a year and has a couple of family members that work incredible hours. But guess what? Because of the fact that he's on the edge of a suburbia city in Iowa, that property has gone up in value. The fact that it's gone up in value, that hasn't increased his income. So he's got this income that he makes. He would really love it to go to his kids because it came from his grandfather to his father to him. But the way the law is now, they're going to look at that and say, oh, but that land's worth $20, $30, $40 million, and the government needs to get its piece. But where do his kids get the money to pay the tax on that? Doesn't exist. Where in that equation is an extra $6 or $8 million laying around? There's not. So what are the kids' choices? They have to sell that property. So the state is basically saying that a family business can't stay intact if there's not sufficient liquidity to pay for it. So I'm a huge proponent of that. I think that People are always looking for creative solutions to move their assets into structures like that. By the way, they just passed a similar law in the United Kingdom. And I was watching a video about it where a farmer, literally right before the new estate tax law went into effect, he was so distraught that he hung himself.
Oh my
because
God.
he wanted his farm to pass to his kids before the law changed. Because when the law changed, he knew that there was no way. The farm had been in his family 17 generations, and it was more important to him that the farm go to his kids than his own life. So he killed himself. How crazy is that?
I like your Brewster Millions suggestion. Just spend it all. That's a good one. I think it's Shaq when he's talking to his kids and they're talking about how much money he has. And he says, I'm rich. You don't have anything, which I thought was funny. Two things that hasn't come up really. One is debt as a tool. And I think a lot of people, they have the Dave Ramsey mindset. I want to be debt free. I don't want any debt in my life. I want the mental clarity of being free from any of that burden. But I've heard you mention before, debt can be used as an actually pretty interesting tool.
I think a lot of people, myself included, you're working hard. You have student debt and then you have mortgage debt. And you're just thinking like, how do I get out of debt? How do I get out of debt? But when you start accumulating assets, particularly assets that are real assets like property and things like that, you can't physically pick them up and move them, right? So this farmer in Iowa or doctor who lives in New Jersey has a big $5 million home in New Jersey and he delivers babies for a living in New York City, like he's going to get sued. Like that's baked into the cake. So how does he protect that asset? And the asset really is by building up debt. We're not talking about credit card debt, which I would consider bad debt, consumer debt. This is strategic debt. If I have a $5 million property in New Jersey and I'm worried about a plaintiff's lawyer taking it, I'm going to go to my bank and say, how much money can I really borrow against this? He's a doctor my age, been practicing a long time, generates a lot of income, and they might still loan him 90, 95% of that value of that home. So let's just use simple numbers, 90%. He can get a $4.5 million loan against his $5 million home. Now he takes that money, he moves it offshore, and let's say he wants very little risk. Well, because of simple supply and demand economics, he can take that $4.5 million. He can probably sit down with a very solid bank. You mentioned the bank that I'm involved with in Belize. We structure this frequently. So he puts the money in a bank in Belize in a CD for 5 years. And right now that interest rate, he might get 5 or 6%. That's going to be pretty close to the rate that he's paying on his mortgage on that property. So yes, he has debt, but he used the debt to acquire another asset, which is producing separate income, and that income is offsetting the debt. So he's kind of created a symbiotic loop, and he hasn't made his life worse. Dave Ramsey's like, well, you got to get out of debt because you don't want this debt hanging over you. Well, in this scenario, you've created some complexity, but you haven't really hurt yourself. And remember, you have this new asset that's paying the cost of your debt in the US. So it's sort of self-servicing debt. So now what happens? Somebody sues me and they see, oh, well, Nagel's got all his assets in a trust and we know we can't touch that. But he's got this property in New Jersey and we see it's worth $5 million. So let's sue him and let's go after that property. And then the plaintiff's attorney does a search of my assets. They find that property, but they also find the debt. And the debt is, let's say, Citibank, New York. So Citibank, New York has this mortgage of $4.5 million. Now the plaintiff lawyer comes back to you and says, well, we could sue him, we could go after the property, but there's this massive mortgage. And what would happen is a judge could force them to sell that property, almost like a foreclosure sale, if we get a judgment against him for this money. But when it goes to auction, the first $4.5 million plus interest, plus fees and costs and legal and this and that, they're going to Citibank. So what's going to be left over? Maybe nothing, or some very small amount. So it's like, what's the old saying? The squeeze just isn't worth the juice at that point. There is no $5 million. It's an illusion. You can't get the money out of the property. They can't sue the trust. Trust is a separate legal juridical person in another country, and they can sue me, but I don't have the asset. So that's really the kind of structure and strategy that we create. That's not really a structure, but it's a great strategy. And I see that more and more with clients that have real estate, because real estate assets in recent years have really, really gone up in value. So even my own house, 30 years ago when I bought my house, I had a lot of debt on it and it wasn't worth that much. And now all of a sudden, when I look at the value of the same property, I mean, nothing's changed, but in 2024 dollars, it's gone up massively. So that means it becomes an asset. You're not going to just walk away from it. Some states, by the way, have what are called homestead exclusion that make it impossible for people to sue and go after your primary home. But Pennsylvania is not one of them. We have that rule, but it only protects $100,000 of your home's value. And it's been that number since I've been practicing law, which is 35 plus years. So the value of $100,000 35 years ago, that was maybe the value of an average home. And 35 years later, I don't know what home you could live in that would only be worth $100,000, but it's not very much protection. Other states, like, for example, Florida, they have an unlimited exemption. So your primary home is your primary home and nobody can ever go after it. And to look at that for a moment, President Trump, for example, when he was going through difficulties, filed bankruptcy on his casinos back in the day, when creditors were coming after him, he bought Mar-a-Lago and he said, "This is my home." He declared it to be his home at that time. And Florida did protect that for him. So he basically took all the wealth he had. He bought one asset in a state that protected your home. And he was able to then use that when the dust settled to pull equity out of it to further his business interests. So it can be a really important tool. Strategy is different depending on which state you live in. If you live in a state that has an unlimited exemption amount like Florida, Texas, there are good states out there that you can use that homestead exemption to protect a lot of wealth. But many states don't have it at all. Some, like Pennsylvania, it's a very limited. That's really why we look at debt. When interest rates were super low, there were actually people doing it as an arbitrage to make money because the supply-demand elements of interest rates were so different in different parts of the world. So they could borrow against their home at 2% and put it in a CD at 5%. So not only were they getting that debt protection, but they were actually making money. Now it's about neck and neck, and maybe even has gone the other way, where you might get that 5% CD offshore and pay 5.5% or 6% for your mortgage. So there's a little bit of a negative cost. People are still doing it because peace of mind they get from doing that.
Wow, this is so great. Two things that we haven't mentioned that I imagine come up a lot in conversation with the folks you're talking to are crypto, Bitcoin in particular, but also we may have glossed over gold, but both flirting with all-time highs recently. So I'm sure front of mind for a lot of people. Are there any general thoughts, comments as you're talking about those assets?
Absolutely. Those two asset classes come up almost with every single client that is looking at doing anything offshore. There's an amazing correlation, by the way, between gold and Bitcoin. For Bitcoiners, refer to Bitcoin as digital gold. It's easier to get a Bitcoiner to embrace gold than to get an old guy, a gold bug, to embrace Bitcoin. But I'm seeing that happen. And I think that the characteristics are similar. In fact, in some ways, the amount of Bitcoin is an absolute number. And gold, it's hard to get more gold. The stores of gold only increase very, very slowly. Mining costs go up more and more. The effort and energy that are required to mine gold is one of the things that makes it more expensive. The fact that our fiat currency is worth less and less means you have to spend more and more of it to get an ounce of gold. In fact, I would argue that gold doesn't go up. It's a purchasing power, right? So 100 years ago, an ounce of gold could buy a finely tailored man's suit. And 100 years later, an ounce of gold could buy a finely tailored man's suit. So did gold go up in value? No, not really. It was $20 then. It was $2,700 now. But it's not that gold's gone up. It's that the dollar's gone down. So the same similarities that exist between gold and Bitcoin are there, and we're seeing more and more crossover. But I think what's really important is that whether it's gold or Bitcoin, people are looking at it as a long-term asset class, and that you can buy, you can forget about, and in 20 years, 50 years, 100 years. If you're thinking generationally, which a lot of our clients are when they're setting up these types of structures, they're not just thinking about themselves or even their children. They have enough money for themselves. They have enough money for their children. So they're really thinking long term. But what are the anchor investments? You could put a company stock in, sure, no problem. But if you go back 100 years to the foundation of, let's say, the Dow, and you come forward 100 years, I think the last company, GE or something went off recently. So over a long period of time, even the best companies are going to turn over. You can't rely on any company now. You could say, well, Apple's a great company, but is Apple going to be around in 100 years? Well, I don't really know. Maybe, maybe not. Is gold going to be a store of value 100 years from now? I believe so. And will Bitcoin be? Yeah, I believe so as well. So these are asset classes that are frequently used in the kind of long-term structures that we create. I told you a couple of times, I'm not on the offense side, I'm on the creation and the defense side. But by doing it over and over and over for all types of different clients, I can certainly tell you that it's those assets along with real estate, I would say, are the three main pillars of offshore investing, with the feeling that those assets are really, they're like sort of internal assets. They're not going to go down in value. Now, old-time gold bugs will say, Joel, well, you're crazy. Bitcoin's only been around for 15 years, and how can you compare it to gold that's been a store of money for 5,000 years? And there's a good point to that. But the fact that Bitcoin has a finite ceiling, and the dollar, as well as all the other fiat currencies in the world, the money supply keeps expanding. So if you're using one asset class, an expanding fiat currency, to buy a physical asset, real estate, gold, Bitcoin, by definition, the amount of those currency units to buy that is going to just go up and up and up. I can't tell you what Bitcoin's going to be like next week. I can't tell you what gold's going to be like next week. But if somebody asks me, you feel pretty comfortable in 5, 10, 20 years, Bitcoin will be worth more then than now? I'd say absolutely. Gold, absolutely. Silver, absolutely. Nice beachfront lot in Nicaragua, absolutely. Because governments aren't going to stop printing money, right? So you're going to need more and more and more of this worthless money. Not worthless, but worth less. Just want to make that distinction. Although Voltaire said every currency will eventually reach its intrinsic value, and that value is zero. It's just a question of how long will it take to get there, right? And the dollar against gold has gone down 98% in the last 100 years, but it might take another 100 years to go the rest of the way. Whereas other currencies, it happens much faster. Look at the Reichsmark in Germany in the 1920s. And in 2 years, it went from 100 Reichsmarks for an ounce of gold to 100 trillion Reichsmarks for an ounce of gold. That's how rampant their inflation was.
We're going to have to definitely do this again. Joel, it has been a blast. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, man. It was really nice. I appreciate you inviting me on. It was a great time spending with you, and I look forward to doing it again.
Podcast listeners will post show notes to today's conversation at mebfaber.com/podcast. If you love the show, if you hate it, shoot us feedback at themebfabershow.com. We love to read the reviews. Please review us on iTunes and subscribe to the show anywhere good podcasts are found. Thanks for listening, friends, and good investing.